Well, thank you all for coming. This is a really good crowd here tonight. Oh, I gotta turn this on too. There we go. Okay, so we are here to talk about this book, just released Monday. I'm very excited about this book, and so obviously you are too, or you wouldn't be here. I wanted to ask before we get started, I'm just curious, how many of you heard about this program tonight through the Missouri State Archives? Either you got a mailer or you saw one of their Facebook posts? That's awesome. How many of you are here because you saw it in the News Tribune? Okay. And how about KJLU? They did a nice piece on it. Anybody hear that? No? Follow KJLU. Lincoln, they're good. Okay. So I guess she kind of already introduced you a little bit to my background, what brought me to this moment in time. But what you may not know is Murder and Mayhem was never my beat at the newspaper. So I like to do the feel-good stories, the happy stories, the people doing good things for other people's stories. Only on a couple of occasions was I pulled in to do some of the hard news stories. And they were never fun. I just wasn't built that way. However, I have a husband who is very interested in true crime and things like that. And he had been a tour guide at the MSP for a while, so he would come home with stories from Mark Schreiber and everything. So I was kind of getting it secondhand. And the publisher that I did Lost Jefferson City and Hidden History with had this title, Murder and Mayhem. Jefferson City. So this is part of a series. You might find a Murder and Mayhem St. Louis or a Murder and Mayhem Missouri. So I didn't choose the topic, I did choose the topic. I did not choose the title. That came from them. And just a little housekeeping. I relied heavily on newspapers and published works for this. Some of the others I used more primary sources, but in this case that's where that came from. This is just a glance overview of things that happened in our past that were murder and mayhem related. It is by no means comprehensive. I also tried very hard to avoid anything in a time frame that any of us would remember. So just trying to go back a little further in time and pull out some of those stories of our past. Okay, so what we're going to talk about, the book is in 3 parts. It's murders, prohibition, and escapes. So murders, there were unfortunately way more murders that I came across that were interesting than I could fit in this book. So there will not be a book 2. I'm not going to do it again. But just a couple that didn't make the book. There was a lady named Clara Dooley Schweiger. She was born here in Jefferson City, moved to Jackson County with her husband, and she wound up being in a divorce hearing, and she and her ex-husband were riding the elevator down from the judge telling her that she could not have an annulment for her divorce. And so everything was fine, everyone thought, until they were in the lobby, and the husband had his back turned buying some cigars in the lobby of the courthouse, and she pulls a gun out of her handbag, shoots him in the back, shoots herself. He dies, she survives, but just an interesting note, her attorney was the first woman attorney in Jackson County to be involved in a murder case in Jackson County. So that's kind of a historic little case there. And then the second part is about prohibition. And I was thinking about that word mayhem. You know, murder's kind of self-evident, but what's something mayhem related that maybe hasn't been talked about that much in Jefferson City history? And I'm fond of Prohibition era in general, just that time in history. And so I thought, well, I haven't really heard too much about Prohibition in the capital city. That's got to be pretty fascinating. And turns out it really is. And Again, this is just a glancing blow. I'm actually hoping that someone might be inspired by this to do a complete book of their own about prohibition in Jefferson City. Finding sources might be a little difficult since most of the activities were things nobody wanted others to know about, but I think that would be fascinating. And then the third part is on escapes. So you can't do a book called Murder in Mayhem Jefferson City without mentioning the Missouri State Penitentiary. However, if you look at the body of work that's been written about Jefferson City history so far, the MSP would probably be right up there as one of the most researched and studied already. So I didn't want to duplicate anything that had already been done, so I started thinking, what impacted people? What's something related to the prison that could maybe, tie in with the community? And escapes certainly fit the bill. It was an amazing amount of escapes in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There was one set of inmates. They put on regular clothes, climbed the ladder over one side of the wall, threw their ladder down on the outside of the wall, started to climb down. One of the guards says, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Oh, we're repairing the wall." And he's like, "Okay." And he left. So that actually turned out to be a pretty fun section to research. So I hope you enjoy it. I did not think I was going to enjoy this topic, but it was definitely a learning experience for me as a writer, and really stretched me, I think, as understanding local history and how it impacts us today, even things that happened decades before. Okay, so this is not in the book, but I was talking with some of my coworkers, and they said, well, it'd be pretty nice to hear a story that didn't make the book, even that, So hopefully you guys are all going to walk out here with a book, by the way. We've got them out in the lobby. This is the story of Anna Weiss. And the reason it didn't make the book is because it happened in St. Louis. Now, probably the reason this might be one of the stories I'm more fond of is because this is nearly a full page of newspaper, and this was broadsheet newspaper, right? Old school, big size newspaper. And both newspapers in St. Louis at the time were giving this murder 2-3 pages of ink every day. And I mean, they were giving blow by blow of the interviews that the cops were going through with their potential people that they thought might have done wrong. And it ultimately was an unsolved crime. But it was an amazing amount of coverage as a newspaper person. So if you guys are on newspapers.com, you can actually find a lot of these stories or these editions for yourself. But just in a nutshell, she was the head chambermaid at the Madison House. And she had gone to St. Louis, she said, to visit her sister for a month. And turns out that when she was found dead by a blow to the head and trampled by a carriage, she was also 5 months pregnant. So that raised some extra questions about who might have caused the murder and why. And turns out that there was a gambler who was coming to the capital city, who was friends with her, and the family knew about him, but they said there's no way he could have done it. And so they never really did solve it. And there's a quote here by one of the police chiefs, 24 years after the fact. He said, "The murder of Anna Weiss is the hardest nut to crack in my experience. I have been on the police force 44 years and have been at this station 24 of them. But no case was ever worked harder with as few tangible results as that crime of 1889. Okay, now we're going to talk about the book. All right. So, the first murder that we're going to talk about is actually the first murder that resulted in a hanging in Cole County that was not related to something that happened at the prison. There had been 2 earlier murders, one of an inmate murdering a guard and one of a guard murdering an inmate. But this third murder was the first not involving them. And There was a lady named Sarah Langley, and she was a young lady born in South Carolina. She came to Callaway County with her family, and that's where she met Didymus Burr. Mr. Burr was born in Connecticut, orphaned at age 3, and wound up coming west with his sister's family, who had converted from Congregationalists to Latter-day Saints. And he learned the carpenter trade from his brother-in-law, and so when he arrived in Callaway County, he was pretty skilled, so he and Sarah decided they would move to Jefferson City. He found plenty of work. He was even a blacksmith at the prison, and he built the old county jail. So they lived in a small frame house on the north side of the 200 block of East High Street. And despite he had plenty of work, and they kept 3 boarders in their home, and they held 4 people enslaved, Burr managed to accumulate quite a bit of debt. And the couple were known to argue. But when Sally died at age 29 after a prolonged illness, no one really suspected foul play. That is until the funeral procession, when the apprentice to Burr asked the man walking next to him if crushed glass was a common ingredient in mixing paint. And he says, well, no, that's not true. Why do you ask? So he said, well, I saw him crushing glass outside the carpentry shop and asked him what he was doing, and that's what he told me. So that stopped things in its tracks. They did an autopsy. They found enough crushed glass in her stomach and bowels sufficient to cause death. So apparently he was feeding her crushed glass with her medicine during her illness. So ironically, he was held in the county jail that he had just helped to build a month earlier. And that's the picture there. So the judge at the time gave him a fair trial, but in the end he said, no doubt exists in the mind of the community as to the justness of the conviction. So he was, like I said, first man to hang in Cole County for a murder not involving the MSP. We think the gallows, well, we know the gallows were west of the Old City Cemetery. We think they were probably about where Simonson's school is. And then he is buried in Woodland Old City Cemetery in an unmarked grave next to Sally. So that's kind of sad, but we didn't have control over that. All right. This may be the saddest story that I came across in the book. So Augustus Bucicris and his family bought a lot on the outskirts of the old Munichburg area from Sheriff Peter Meyer in 1866. Now, they were neighbors, but they had differing backgrounds, faith, professions, and wealth. It was perhaps that Meyer took pity on the Bucicris family. Bucicris' wife, Mary, had been raped a year earlier, and they chose to rear the baby, who was part black. Now, Bucicris was a carpenter who struggled to pay his debts and to keep his family together. So, a late night, October 1876, he returns to his home, finds his daughter Marie in his bedroom with the teenage neighbor fleeing out the window, leaving his pants behind. So, Bucicris writes a letter to the sheriff stating his grievances with his son, and that included the accusation of $80 missing from his bedroom dresser. So the next day, the young James Meyer appears at the gate. There was a gate that separated the 2 houses. He appears at the gate, and he's concerned that his reputation will be damaged for being accused of being a thief. So he's trying to understand why this is happening. Oh, did I mention that James Meyer was a deputy for his father? So you have a teenage deputy carrying a deputy's weapon, hollering at this neighbor who's accused him of breaking the law. So this kind of escalates, right? The father's very upset about what's happening with his family, and the boy's trying to protect his reputation. And so things kind of get to a thread, and so Meyer says, I'm gonna blow your head off. Bucicris runs in his house to get his gun, and at that point, Marie, the daughter, is watching out the window, and she yells for James to run. And so he does, but not before Bucicris comes out of the house with his weapon in hand, aims, fires, wasn't loaded. So Bucicris sends his son to get ammunition. At the same time, the young teenage deputy goes down to the Mouse Home Saloon down on Monroe Street and gets a few drinks in him, walks back to Old Munichburg, stops at the Linhart store and borrows a shotgun from a friend and buys some duckshot. He's walking back up to the house, and his mom comes out. Mom's going to solve this problem right now. So, walks her son back to the gate. Son is still carrying the loaded shotgun. Walk to the gate. Starts a conversation again with Mr. Vucicris, who comes back out of the house again, standing on his porch. Young deputy is trying to protect his honor of not breaking the law. Vucicris is trying to defend his family and feels that they've been aggrieved. Escalates verbally. So Vucicris says, or he just turns, and he said, "I'm going to shoot you." And before he could get through the doorway, his back turned to the teenage deputy, he gets shot in the back. So this teenage deputy, loaded shotgun, standing next to his mother, fires at this guy with his back turned. So the initial coroner's inquest, made up primarily of other neighbors from the South Side, found Meyer guilty of first-degree murder. The First Circuit Court jury also agreed with the coroner's inquest, but a second jury released him on acquittal. But his dad was not reelected to sheriff. All right. So I felt like I needed to find something from the Civil War era, and I'm actually surprised and pleased at how many people have already heard the story of Private John Wilcox. But if you haven't, here we go. He was born in Miller County, and he joined the Confederate, the rebel cause as a teenager. And he served under Sterling Price. He was at the battles of Carthage and Wilson's Creek, and he was wounded at Lebanon before the army went south to Arkansas. His last detail before he deserted in the spring of 1864 was detailed on Secret Service duty. So I wish there were more records. We researchers always say that, right? I wish there were more records, but man, a spy in the Confederate Army, that would be cool. All right, so spring of 1864, Wilcox is deserted the army. He's coming home, and right before he gets home, he's in Cole County. There's a barn dance happening. He's already changed out of his army uniform. He's still got a saber and a Union revolver, and then he's got some Confederate cash on him. A group of the Union troops out of Jefferson City makes their way out. They're doing a patrol, and they come on the barn dance, and well, they call everybody out, and of course, here he is. And serving 3 years in the regular army, he told an interviewer after the fact, he said, "I assumed that the Union soldiers were going to kill me." So he ran. They shot him in the stomach. They thought it was going to be fatal, so they brought him back to Jefferson City to the General Hospital here. And then they did the interview with him and the other people involved, and that's where we get most of the information. Okay, so then once they had taken the statements and everybody had kind of figured out this is what had happened, this is who's who, the provost marshal in the Central Missouri District says, "Wilcox will be shot to death with musketry as soon as he is sufficiently recovered to leave the hospital." So he was shot in March, and then he attempted an escape in June, but he didn't get very far. The farmer who found him felt sorry for him, brought him back to the hospital under Union guard. So he was back in the hospital, back under Union eyes. And at about that same time, the Confederate guerrillas led by Wiley Shoemate were rampaging, pillaging, murdering in Miller County and the surrounding area. And so a special order was issued that tied Wilcox's fate to the behavior of these bushwhackers. It said, "Upon the first overt act of lawlessness committed by this or any other band of guerrillas or bushwhackers upon the lives or property of the people of this district, the prisoner John Wilcox will be immediately shot." The order called him a member of Shoemate's band, which is impossible because he had been down south with Price's army until he came home and got shot. But not surprising, the bushwhackers didn't stop. So the 20-year-old Wilcox stood before a firing squad August 12, 1864, at a scaffold built near Wares Creek, so just down here a little ways. The first firing squad missed, or they didn't have ammunition. So a second squad was organized. 6 balls of the 12 guns took his life. His sister took the body back to the family cemetery in Miller County. After the war, she hired hitmen to take out the Union officers who were responsible for her brother's execution. And then the law chased down those guys and murdered them. So quite a feud was a result of all of that. So I classify it as murder because he was not punished for his own crimes. Let's see, yep, we got Mr. Tritch on here. So John Tritch had learned the saddle making trade when he was in Ohio, and he came to Jefferson City to work at the prison at the Sullivan Saddle Tree Company. One of his sons, Robert, served in France during World War I, and after his return, they bought the Mill Bottom Bakery. It was the restaurant owned by the McKinney brothers at 509 West Main. So November 12th, 1923, lots of neighborhood children here in the Mill Bottom were playing cops and robbers. So an 18-year-old walks in with his face covered, demanding money and pointing a revolver at him. No doubt he thought they were playing a game too. So the friendly restaurant owner says, "Wait, let me show you the gun that we keep here." And he reaches down, to which the youth shot him in the stomach. And because William Gray, the shooter, was already drunk and surprised by what he had just done, he ran out without the money. And he was pursued by the younger Tritch, Robert, and they exchanged shots running up West Main Street. And then William Gray was eventually caught by the constable in the old railroad tunnel because his getaway boat sank. So the boy pled guilty to murder. He admitted that a 49-year-old Emmett Kinnaman had influenced him. Now, Kinnaman had provided him with the restaurant layout, he had provided him with the liquid motivation, and he had provided him with the revolver, which he stole from the Jefferson City Sand Company office, which was across the street at the time. So William Gray was actually from England, and so he wound up being deported and sent back to England. Kinnaman, he was also found guilty of his involvement, but he was paroled from his life sentence after only 18 years. Okay, so Officer Wallace Lawson was the first policeman to die in the line of duty. He was a popular barbecue cook before he was appointed as the policeman to the Lafayette Street District. Now, back in that time, you didn't have to have any training or any kind of skill. It was political appointment, so all he had to do was be in the right party, and here you go, which was true for all of the officers at the time. So he had just been reappointed for his second year in April of 1934. About 1 a.m., he hears a disturbance at Bill's Cafe, which was on Lafayette Street at the time. He entered to find James Turner arguing with a waiter. Officer Lawson told Turner to go home. He may have hit Turner with a blackjack. When Turner left the cafe, he turned around and cursed the police officer. So Lawson chased Turner all the way to his home down Miller Street, which was at the intersection with Chestnut Street, I believe where the city bus barn is now. So Turner enters his home, grabs his shotgun and shells, runs out the back. Lawson steps onto the front porch while Turner is coming around. That's where stories start to diverge. So there were a varied number of shots, varied number of who shot when who, but in the end, a shotgun shell went through Lawson's torso, took his life in a matter of seconds. About 600 people, both black and white, attended his funeral. And for Turner, he fled. Now, he first, instead of just immediately leaving town, oh my gosh, I just killed a police officer, he goes to Central Hotel where he works to get his paycheck. And he tells the clerk, I just shot a police officer. And the clerk said later, I thought he was joking, I didn't know. So he grabs his paycheck, gets on a train, winds up in Kansas City. Eventually he comes back and turns himself in. At the trial, the Turner's defense was basically arguing that Lawson was a bully, and it was a lot of he was worse than he was, and who was actually the worst guy. And in the end, Turner got 5 years for manslaughter. He got out, he beat his wife, he went back to jail, he got out, he threatened someone else with a knife, went back to jail. So you can kind of make your own assessment of that. So, and then we have Professor Romeo West. He was born in St. Louis. He came to Lincoln at age 14. He was quite the student and athlete. He spent about 15 years rising in different positions at Lincoln University, including the assistant to the president and becoming the school's first head librarian. Now, he did leave for a few years, and during that time he was the principal of the black school over in California. But then he came back to Lincoln, and on this particular night, a fellow named Theodore Martin, who had been there just about a year, had been hired to be the superintendent of the school's boarding house. And they had a quarrel because West wanted to use some dishes for a social event, and Martin said no. And so West left, came back with a weapon, threatened Martin. Martin, knowing his temper, because West had already stabbed Martin with a fish gig in the past. So Martin winds up grabbing the weapon from West, shooting him 3 times, and he died right away. The jury exonerated Martin, and he left Lincoln soon after that. But he did say that he promised to live a life in the future so that the people who made that decision would not regret it. Okay, we're going to talk about prohibition. Anybody else in here fond of the Prohibition era like I am? Yeah? All right. Well, you got to read the book, because I got to tell you, I'm skimping. There's a lot of really cool stuff, just little bits and pieces to just enough to whet your interest, and maybe somebody in here will take up that charge and write a full book on it, because I would love to read it. So the 18th Amendment went into effect January 1920. One of the many characters who were successful at running liquor during this time was Paul Schmidt. He was the grandson of a pioneer blacksmith and a 1916 graduate of J.C. High School. Before Prohibition, he worked as a projectionist at the Capitol Theater in the 100 block of East High, just around the corner from his grandfather's shop on Jefferson Street. When his still was cooking the rye whiskey, the smoke could be seen 7 miles upriver standing on the Missouri River Bridge. So it had to be a pretty big facility. In 1924, 4 years after Prohibition began, Schmidt sold the still operation to Fred Schilling. We'll talk about Fred in a minute. So Schmidt had enough funds to buy his grandfather's blacksmith shop and the adjacent buildings. He renovated, added on, and created what we know today as the Schmidt Apartments. Inside, he opened the city's first radio shop. In the basement, he garaged a 1925 Lincoln with aluminum body and a V8 engine, able to outrun any law enforcement of the day. So he got smart, realized that rather than selling liquor to the local places, he would make drops at Mount Sterling and sell to the St. Louis buyers coming out of town so they don't get caught. He had a good thing going, obviously, because he never got caught. So during this time, Schmidt was quite the entrepreneur. He also was running cockfighting, slot machines, and other gambling venues. And after Prohibition was lifted, Schmidt became the local Falstaff beer distributor for 30 years. But poor Fred Schilling. Fred did not have the same luck that Schmidt did. So he was a World War I sailor from Ohio, and he had a reputation as a prize fisherman before Prohibition. He bought the still from Schmidt. This was off St. Louis Road, back in the dense woods. And he had the unfortunate experience of just a few weeks after he bought it, he got raided. And it was by Gus Nations, who was the prohibition officer out of St. Louis, and his brother Haber Nations, who we will talk about a little bit more. Now, Haber Nations owned one of the newspapers that was operating here in Jefferson City at the time. And both of the Nations brothers were going on these raids with the other law enforcement officials, and they were going all over the county. But on this day, at the Schmidt still that Mr. Schilling had just bought, they found a 500 gallons a day distillery. It was the largest and most complete setup that the brothers had uncovered up till that time. Then they noticed, let me see, did I use the right picture? Yes. If you look closely at that photo on your right, you might see a little dent in the still. So they got to looking and noticed some of those parts came from a still that they had raided just the last week at a different farm. So they decided they were really going to break down on this, so they used an axe. Nope, that didn't work. They sent people back to town. They got dynamite, they got coal oil, and they blew that thing up. So, poor Mr. Schilling, let's talk to him about him a minute. So he was in and out of court for liquor violations. His wife sometimes took the charge so that he wasn't in jail all of the time. At one point, they left Jefferson City and went to Westphalia for a while. He spent some time in Fort Leavenworth Federal Prison. At the end of Prohibition, they operated a barbecue stand at the Osage River Bridge Inn, which was raided. And then they opened a taxi service out of their home on Jefferson Street, which was raided. So, poor guy could not catch a break. All right, now we're going to get to what was the most startling find for me in all of this research. In the mid-1920s, a second wave of the Ku Klux Klan activity was sweeping the nation. One of the big issues at this time was immigration. In mid-Missouri, it hit in full swing in the summer of 1923 with a lynching in Columbia. The chapter in Jefferson City emerged in August of 1923. They met in the third floor meeting room of the Merchants Bank building at the corner of Jefferson and High Streets. The next night after that meeting, a fiery cross was set up outside a house of ill repute in the Foote area. The second night after that meeting, the WOS radio tower at the Capitol was set on fire. The third night after that meeting, another fiery cross was lit on 10 Mile Drive outside a known roadhouse. The next night, a fiery cross was set in front of the courthouse across from Commercial Way from the New Moon Hotel, which was operated by a black businessman. Community leaders condemned the vigilante attacks. The Jefferson City Klan ran a full-page ad saying their hostility was aimed at bootleggers, professional gamblers, and vice. They went on to say they had no enmity towards Jews, blacks, or Catholics. Well, Joseph Goldman, who was Jewish, was the editor of the Jefferson City Democrat Tribune, and he didn't let them have it. Haber Nations, if you recall from the raids, was the reported exalted cyclops of the Jefferson City Klan. His daily post office was on Madison Street, and it was one of 5 businesses that experienced retaliation as known Klan-owned businesses with a drive-by shooting the week after this happened. I didn't know that a drive-by shooting had ever occurred in downtown Jefferson City. So then things cooled a few months. And then in February of 1924, the statewide Klan held its meeting in the House of Representatives down at the Capitol, the brand new Capitol. Now, it was not unusual at the time. Lots of local organizations had used the Capitol for meetings and things. What was different was they closed and locked the doors and posted sentries. They were told they can't do that again. So then we go to October of 1924. October 1924 is when our current Capitol was dedicated, and the Klan was there. They had a stand right next to every church handing out sandwiches. They were advertising their big Klan gathering that was going to happen the next week, and it was just like it was par for the course. And then they had their big gathering, which was quite an event, according to the newspapers. And then in November of 1924, they elected their sheriff that they wanted, and all of the Klan activity died down. That was the last that I could find of it. Now, I'm not going to talk to you tonight about Sheriff Whithaupt, who is the guy that they really wanted, but let me just say that that man and his officers broke the law to enforce the law. So if that doesn't get you to buy a book. All right, so most of the last section is on escapes, but I came across in Mark Schreiber's book the mention of another riot, and it was amazing to me that we had never heard about this riot, except for the fact, 1954 riot, lots of people died. This riot, nobody died. So it's a good thing, not so great for being remembered. So what happened, there were about 750 inmates sitting in the prison dining hall for lunch in March of 1930, and then they decided they were not going to go back to work in the prison factories afterward. There was a nonviolent protest. They were simply saying that they had poor food quality, it was overcrowded, and they were having long hours to work in the factories. So Governor Caulfield declared a state of emergency. The iron gates to the prison were locked, and the information was withheld from the public, but the local National Guard unit was activated. Warden Long was called back to the prison from a meeting where, ironically, he was talking about developing the Algoa Correctional Center, which would have alleviated two of their major problems. Excuse me. All right, so Warden Long managed to talk the men down, assured them that he would explore their concerns, and then they departed. Now, the prison was designed for 2,600 inmates, and at the time, it held 4,060. The overcrowding caused them to cut many corners, including food choices. On that particular day, they had raw potatoes in their Irish stew because of faulty boilers. So, the next day, hundreds of inmates again refused to leave their breakfast tables. And when they began banging on the tables, inmates inside many of the factories began to strike as well. They called in the local guard unit again. This time they also called in the St. Louis machine gun unit. They set up one machine gun on top of the warden's office and another opposite the dining hall in the courtyard. So unlike the first day, the local police and fire personnel were both allowed in, and they were armed. They threw tear gas into the dining hall. At that point, about 300 of the inmates fled. They weren't involved in it, they were just trapped inside with the other guys. The remainder continued to be contrary and received blows from the guards, but no shots were fired. In all, there was about 1,200 inmates who were involved in the uprising, compared to only 165 guards on duty. The ringleaders were sent to I Hall for solitary confinement. The machine guns were there for 5 days. But the governor praised the prison authorities for handling the situation admirably and without shots fired or loss of life. I do apologize. All right, we got one more, and then we'll be out of here. Okay, you guys have probably seen the photo just before the only triple hanging in Cole County. This is the story, and it's something out of a Wild West show. There were 6 inmates conspired for a breakout in 1905. One was released early. He was sent with the money to buy the tools and stuff for the others to escape. Went down to Jasper County, to the mining area, and got some nitroglycerin, went to a pawn shop in Kansas City and got some revolvers. Then he breaks back into the prison to stow the gear for the other guys. So the day was chosen because the warden and 6 of the guards were transferring about 70 federal prisoners to Fort Leavenworth. The first thing the other 5 did, they went to Deputy Warden C's office. Now they were hoping just to get the keys from him and go on their merry way. Of course, he wasn't going to comply. He was a former sheriff himself. So they shot him in the wrist, took him and the visitors in his office, used them as human shields, ran across the yard to get to the wagon entrance. Now the gatekeeper had just opened the inner gate for a delivery, so the inmates rushed him, his name was John Clay, and they immediately shot him to death. They demanded that the deputy warden unlock the outer gate doors. And that's when another guard, Ephraim Allison, arrived. He was also fatally shot. At that point, Warden C was shot again in the shoulder, and he fell to the ground. The other two victims ran away. They were clear. That's when guard J.K. Young approached the men at the wagon entrance. He also was shot. Now, at the same time all of this is going on, one of the guys is using the nitroglycerin on the outer gate. And it blew a, did I use that picture? Yep. It blew a 3.5-foot hole in the double steel outer gate. So, now they're outside. They make a run for it down State Street. The plan was they were going to steal a train, but while they're running, one of the guards happened to be a good shot and took out the one guy who knew how to drive the train. So now we're down to 3, and they're running. So they get to the train station. What are we going to do? They decide, let's hijack this wagon sitting here. Poor Arthur Lane was just sitting there waiting to pick up the passengers from the train, and here they come. And did they let him go? No, they put him in the bed of the wagon. So he goes on this chase with them. So they're driving at a high rate of speed, right? They leave the depot, they go up to Madison, they go past the governor's mansion, they go through downtown, they make it over to the south side, and they're asking Arthur Lane, how do we get out of town? How do we get out of town? Well, is Arthur going to tell them how to get out of town? No. So he's leading them all through the south side, long enough for the police officers to catch up with them. And of course there's a gun battle going, there's bullets flying. Arthur Lane would be in the bar telling this story for the rest of his life. He's laying there, bullets flying. And so our third man falls off the wagon over at Marshall Brewery. And before they can really get going again, another employee jumps out, grabs the horses by the bridle. The worst member of the gang jumps down, takes his pistol, gets it right in the fellow's face, but it jams. And that was just in time for the police officer to arrive and apprehend him, got him. So that worked out. That was the end of the Wild West show here in Jefferson City that day. Guard John Clay was buried in Woodland Old City Cemetery. More than 3,000 mourners came to the ceremony, and Governor Folk spoke. Guard Ephraim Allison, he had survived the Civil War as a captain of one of the Confederate units that saw the highest casualty rate. So he survived that and then was killed as a guard at the prison. So the first trial ended in a hung jury for 2 reasons. One, they tried all of them together instead of as individual sentences. The other reason was there were guards from the prison who stood behind the 3 men at the desk with this ready to go in case they caused. So it was not appropriate in a courtroom. So they had to do the trial all over again. So obviously this time they had guilty verdicts and the sentence of hanging. The scaffold was built behind the Cole County Jail where the Jeff City Police Department is today. Father Giesert from St. Peter Church visited with the men before their execution. He claimed their bodies afterward, and he saw that they were interred at the prison cemetery. Now, if you don't know, the prison cemetery at the time is where Lincoln University's library and Scruggs Hall are today. And as for Mr. Spencer, the fellow who was released and broke back in and broke out again, he was never found. So that is a brief look at murder and mayhem, Jefferson City. And if we have time, I would take some questions.